Okay, so welcome to the cover seminar. I'm really excited because we have Landon Frim and Harrison Fluss here who are going to be talking about their amazing book that is also part of the book series, and it was actually the first book that's been published in the book series, which is on politics and economics after work for Anthem Press. I was really excited about this book as the editor and creator of the book series because I think in many ways, it's kind of served as a foundation for how we can begin to actually think about what a sustainable kind of post-capitalist society can and should be, and what are the kind of deeper ethics and logics for thinking this. So I wanted to just do a brief introduction, and then I'll hand it over to Landon and Harrison, and then we'll have a broader discussion around this. But I think this book insightfully critiques two contemporary ideological extremes, and I think it's very well framed, which is the Promethean accelerationists who seek to transcend humanity through technology, and the Gaian eco-feminists who kind of valorize nature over human interest. And I think in this sense, the authors both kind of understand that these trends both reject humanism and embrace an unknowable mystical metaphysics at odds with science and emancipatory politics. In response, and I would be biased on this, but I think it's fair, the book compellingly argues for reclaiming the humanistic spirit of the Enlightenment. And this involves embracing a rationalist worldview where nature is intelligible to human reason and science and emancipatory ideas. And here they argue for a particular type of rationalism which grounds national laws, materialism, freedom, and the possibility of social progress. I think the book rejects portraying humanity as either master or servants of nature, and instead it advocates a balanced relationships where humans exercise collective agency to rationally understand and instrumentally shape nature for human welfare. This represents a radically and revolutionary democratic vision of shared participation in wielding technology for the common benefit. The book's call for a reconciliation of Prometheus and Gaia symbolizes overcoming alienation and bringing humanity's power in harmony with itself and nature. This requires social transformation to realize a liberatory humanistic modernity. The book thus articulates a bold and thoughtful vision that upholds human dignity while avoiding the pitfalls of mystical anti-humanism. Its timely message underscores that humanism, naturalism, and democracy must be synthesized to address the problems of our age. The book's critique of accelerationism and eco-pessimism highlights the need for a political economy that avoids both hyper-individualism and anti-humanism. Its call for reconciling humanity's collective agency with nature suggests the promise of an economy that can actually be based, which is the kind of focus of our research center, on kind of commons resource ownership and a post-capitalist mode of production. Commons ownership here means, in a very similar way, is about how we are shared collectively and managed democratically for communal benefit. And I think that the ability to move beyond these two ideological extremes that, in my view, they really nicely put out in their own way, reinforce our contemporary exploitative capitalism, is a way in which they're actually gesturing towards and prefiguring a type of political economy that prevents appropriation for private profit while still allowing for the instrumental use of nature to improve human welfare. And that's something that I quite think is brilliant about, can we think about reason and rationality? And even to a certain extent, though, I think it's worth exploring this instrumentality in a way that isn't based on appropriation, accumulation, and exploitation. And in many ways, I think that's, whenever I read their work, not just this book, but that's one of the things that I find myself most excited about. So achieving this, and I think it's fair to say that, requires revolutionary change. So the book's embrace of humanity's transformative powers implies change must come through mass political action, not just personal lifestyle choices. Its Promethean experience of defiance and social transformation can also motivate organizing for eco-socialist revolution. Such revolution would overturn capitalism's logic of endless appropriation, which underlies the climate crisis, and democratizing the ownership of the means of production for types of green production guided by rational planning could allow for technological advancement without alienation. And I think this kind of vision would help fulfill the book's vision of reconciling the technological power with social and ecological flourishing. So just to conclude, I think the book's humanistic spirit and values align with the type of nationalism, suggest how common ownership and revolutionary ecosystem can be a new kind of modernist-based vision and humanist-based vision for the political economy. This would avoid the antinomian mysticism of existing ideologies, and it would kind of go beyond ideas of this kind of technological determinism and a type of optimism that I think actually just plays into the very logics which created this crisis, or a type of eco-pessimism in which humans are in many ways already devalued and kind of given a type of alienation that is in addition to capitalist alienation, right? In which we have no collective agency or enabling forces. And I think this would allow us then to create different types of modes of production and ideologies for creating an economy that serves both human welfare and environmental sustainability. So I believe the book's ideas could powerfully inspire both academics, but also activists to unite humanity's interests with nature's through this type of humanist-based revolutionary transformation. So I hope that does well to summarize in a certain sense some of the key aspects of your book. Even though I was a part of the editor, we are in a dialectical moment at a time. So please feel free also to share that I might have missed some of the key aspects that you also wanted to highlight in that respect. But I'm very excited then to now give the kind of Zoom stage, as it were, to Landon and Harrison to talk about this really inspiring book and the types of incredible vision that and ideas that inspired it. So thank you both very much.
So I thought that was really well said, and I think you captured a lot of what the sort of impetus behind the book was. Let me just make a couple brief comments, and then I'll hand it over to Harrison, who can speak more at length. So the first thing I think that needs to be put out there is that, because this is a lot of the reaction that we got when we were pitching the book and thinking about it, is like, okay, these terms, accelerationist and Gaean, or Promethean and Gaean, if you go out into the street, and not even just out onto the street, but if you talk to climate scientists, climate activists, and then just sort of average, voters, no one, like, I wouldn't say no one uses these terms, but they're not the most popular terms. Like, most people don't say, I am a Promethean, I am a Gaean. Some people do, but it's not these are not hegemonic terms. The case, sort of as a baseline, the case that we make in this book is that although people might not self-consciously use these terms, most people who think at all about the climate, and because of the horrors that we read in the newspaper every day, more people are thinking about climate and climate catastrophe and climate breakdown, sort of at the very least subconsciously adopt one of these basic perspectives, right? So that there's a sorting going on of policy prescriptions, a sorting of temperament, all right? And the Prometheans, whether they call themselves Prometheans or not, right, believe that basically there's something like a tech fix, that you've got to go big, right? That it's about nuclear, it's about geoengineering, and that the solution to climate breakdown is sort of growing our way out of the problem. And the Gaeans, whether they use that name or not, and most often not, right, have the exact opposite attitude, that it's about small is beautiful, all right, to use the sort of old phrase from the 80s and 90s, right, that we have to be humble, tread lightly upon the earth. That's the way out of this catastrophe. And so the only thing that I would say, I think your characterization was excellent, but we want to sort of resist the idea that these are the sort of two extremes, and that what should be done is a sort of humane and humanistic splitting of the difference. I think rather, our point is that what appears to be two extremes really have a lot in common. So this is like the sort of dual problem of the book. One, these things are not named, so we name them, okay? And we try and show the sort of intellectual background between the Promethean and Gaean worldview. And two, we want to sort of rip the mask off of the sort of common rhetoric that these are two extremes and that we need some sort of moderate pragmatic humanism to go right down the middle. Instead, these are a coincidence of opposites. We'll talk more about this during sort of this session, but briefly, to give a bit of a teaser, right? The coincidence of opposites is that Well, they operate according to a kind of irrationalism, don't they? Right? Whether you're a Promethean, okay, and you think that it's all about sort of human free creation, and that matter is less than nothing, and that nature can be endlessly plastic, and therefore there's nothing to really know about nature, and therefore nothing to know about human nature or a place in nature. Well, that's a kind of irrationalism. But so is the opposite. So is the sort of Gaian position that nature is forever transcendent, beyond and above us, cannot be known, and not only cannot be known, but that it is wrong to try and know it, that it is sort of a vulgar intellectualism to try and tease the sort of logic of nature out of it, that we should be sort of prostrate before nature as though before like a holy altar. Well, that's a kind of irrationalism too. And if anything, I hope that people get that out of the book, that these enemy camps have a lot more in common than either would like to admit.
First of all, thank you so much for inviting us. So thanks to the University of Essex. Thanks, Peter, for asking us these questions and for introducing us. Landon and I are really inspired by what Marx says in the economic and philosophical manuscripts, that humanism is a naturalism and naturalism is a humanism. So we need to have a more substantial concept of nature before we can even really talk about human nature. That as humanists, we don't want anthropocentrism. As Carl Sagan said, the human is one of the ways the universe knows itself. But that does mean trying to define what our human needs are with this more rational concept of nature. And when Marx in the Grundrisse says there's this logic of capitalism that you can understand in political economy between accumulation and austerity, those are ideologically taken up in terms of positivism versus romanticism. And Marx says in the Grundrisse, you're always going to have this dualism until the end of bourgeois society. And Marx tries to set up this new solution to the contradictions of history, where human beings will be reconciled with their human nature, their species being, and that will set up a kind of reconciliation with nature itself. And when Landon and I talk about Prometheus and Gaia, we try to go all the way back into these ancient Iron Age myths from Hesiod, who really, in the Theogony poem, introduces Gaia and Prometheus for the first time. And we see these myths as myths kind of neutral. You can take these myths in different ways, just like you can take different characters in literature and stories in different ways. But sometimes how Prometheus and Gaia are taken up, they're given either a left-wing kind of content, a centrist kind of content, or a right-wing kind of content. So when it comes to the Promethean, you can take up the Promethean in the way that Percy Shelley did in Prometheus Unbound, and show that Prometheanism can be humanist, revolutionary, and pro-environment, because Gaia and Prometheus and the people monster, the Demigorgon, team up to fight Jupiter, to overthrow Jupiter, to have a new kind of rational dispensation. Or you can take up these myths in really reactionary ways, like Ayn Rand does in Atlas Shrugged and The Fountainhead, where you have a kind of Prometheanism that is deeply anti-democratic and elitist. And what Landon and I want to do is show that you can take up these myths in a more rational way without falling into mysticism.
I think that's a really nice kind of deepening of what the project is about and why it's important, right? And I guess, you know, one of the first things I want to ask is that, you know, you mentioned, Landon, these are kind of like, I would almost say types of spirits or types of logics, a way of sorting things and organizing types of perspectives for action. And Harrison, you mentioned, you know, I think in a broader sense that these are kind of myths. But I wanted to kind of better understand why you think what's the importance of Prometheus and Gaia in contemporary discourse, and how do you think they continue to shape what are considered the limits of human possibility in relation to nature? And I think one of the reasons that I'm interested in that I think would be a good discussion is that, you know, obviously, I think the point Harrison made is that these can be put out in a variety of different ways, right? But they haven't. They've kind of evolved socially in this way. So what do you think it is historically that has made these so important? How do you think they're starting to organize praxis and action right now? And what do you see as the ways in which, given the conditionalities in which they've emerged at this point, that they really can be kind of radicalized? So, I mean, why do you think, I guess, similar something Promethean and Gaia have historically evolved to become these kind of dominant myths? What roles are they actually playing in terms of really kind of hegemony? And what do you think this says then about what ways in which we need to rethink current attempts at kind of a revolutionary or radical environmental politics?
So one of the critical distinctions we make in the book is between a mythical and a mystical understanding of these images. And so, at least the way we define it, is that a mystical understanding sort of fetishizes, it gives power, it gives objectivity, it reifies the image themselves, right? And so I think this is basically superstitious. And this is how, nonetheless, a lot of people think about these images of Prometheus and Gaia and other images as well. Besides, it's as though there's sort of objective and variant content in what it means to be, let's say, Prometheus. And so anti-Prometheans will say Prometheus is just toxic, right? It's instrumentalist, it's perhaps misogynistic, and there's no sort of redeeming it. That's the sort of mystical orientation. Our view in the book is that one ought to take a far more rationalist, which is to say mythological interpretation of these symbols, meaning that we are the ones doing the instrumentalizing, right? That sort of, it is up to us how to employ, redeploy, manage, and sometimes augment the symbols that we inherit, right? And I think there's a lot of work to be done there, right? I mean, people don't speak in treatises all the time. Political slogans, protest placards are not generally, if they're any good, represented as sort of long-form philosophical essays. So we need our images. It's no good trying to say, well, let's just do logland, let's just do a logical language and jettison these because they're problematic. What I want to do is use them. And the thing is, though, if you take a properly mythological reading of these symbols, then that puts a lot of responsibility on you. Once you're very upfront and explicit that there's no power in these symbols themselves, but they are simply instruments that you use to express a certain worldview, then the onus is then on you to defend that worldview from the ground up. I mean, this is why, Harris and I do a lot of other work. I mean, we were discussing earlier the Reason is Red article that came out in Spectre, the idea that there is no revolutionary praxis without revolutionary theory. Well, that's right, because without first principles, you don't know if your praxis is right, and you don't know if your use of symbols is appropriate either. So I think at the very least we have to start there. It's sort of, what is the structure of symbolic use?
I think there's two different kinds of questions. One is relating to the historical conjuncture, and what is relating to the possibilities of the human. So in terms of the historical conjuncture, 19th century isn't over yet. We have these contradictions between exchange value and use value, between forces of production, relations of production, and we have this new phenomenon of mass society. And the way that accelerationism and eco-pessimism are responding to it is to overcome mass society in one or two ways. The accelerationist wants to create a whole new shiny future, which is going to problematize and get rid of this conception of the human. One of the pioneering, if you can call him that, accelerationists is Nick Land. Nick Land and Fang Noumena, collection of essays edited by Brassier, I think, and Robert McKay. He says humanity is a drag. The proletariat is not revolutionary. Capital is revolutionary. And we need to go big or go home. You shouldn't tame it. So this is a kind of apotheosis of accumulation. It's an ideological apotheosis of accumulation. In terms of the Gaian or the eco-pessimist position, the human is not inflated to be this heroic Ubermensch. The human is kind of demonized as being a blight upon the earth, and that we need to sort of humble ourselves before this mysterious tremendum that is nature. And what that's going to do is enforce patterns of austerity. So on the one hand, you have an ideological apotheosis of accumulation. On the other, you have an ideological apotheosis of austerity, and they're two sides of the same bourgeois coin. Although it seems obscure and they seem anti-bourgeois, but without mass society, without an international socialist movement, these ideological positions are going to reinforce those same 19th century logics that we're still dealing with today.
And I think that leads on to my kind of next question, which is, and this might be an opportunity to kind of link some of these things, but, you know, given your wide-ranging interests, which I do think kind of discusses a kind of revolutionary modernity and humanism on the one hand, a very serious attempt to create first principles or philosophize them, as he's mentioned, Landon, all the way to I think your current work, which is on looking at some far right neoconservative figures and understanding, you know, what the structure and logic of their argument are, what's their appeal, and what are ways in which we can deconstruct and challenge them. I mean, why was this book something that you kind of wanted to write first? I think in terms of things, like why was this so important for you, and how does this fit within, I would say, the kind of broader interests that you both together and individually are working on? Because I do think that there's a lot of interesting things that you're doing, and certainly making, I think, very strong interventions and provocations and points. And I'd be interested, like, how this book fits within that broader, I would say, is it fair to say, revolutionary intellectual project?
Well, I would just say that, you know, it's important to not only combat your enemies, but critique your friends. That's how you get clear about your own ideas. So, right, we're writing a book now on sort of a debunking book, a philosophical debunking book, but a debunking book on figures like Peterson and Musk and Tate. And well, the orientation of a book like that is that people who hang out with us tend to agree that those are bad guys, but we might not agree, you know, precisely why. A book like Prometheus and Gaia is a little bit different. Although there are sort of anti-democratic, anti-socialist figures who might call themselves accelerationist and Gaean, quite a many of them would like to consider themselves our comrades, or at least on a good day. But it's no less important, and maybe perhaps sometimes it's far more important to, you know, as politely and charitably and collegially as possible, you know, highlight and sharpen those distinctions and differences amongst those, you know, quote unquote, in your own camp. Because otherwise that first kind of work where you highlight the differences between yourself and those perhaps on the right will be less sure. So we have to, and not to sort of be a broken record here, but it's true, we have to get down to first principles. You can't get down to first principles if you have a sort of weak tea overlapping consensus as the basis of your socialist politics. And a work like Prometheus and Gaia sort of gets down to that nitty gritty. It sharpens the question: do we need a notion of objective intelligible nature, a notion of human nature which is derived in part of that overall nature, and therefore a notion of the human good, what is good for human nature, in order to proceed with a political program? Well, look, I mean, either yes or no. And there are intelligent people on both sides of that debate, but I think only one answer is correct. If you say no, okay, that produces an entirely different kind of politics, a different kind of strategy, and a different kind of daily tactic. And that's why this question can't be avoided.
Landon and I, when we're analyzing the alt-right or fascism or certain reactionary trends within continental philosophy, we're writing for the left. We're coming out of a continental philosophy context. Landon and I went to school together at Stony Brook. And a lot of our colleagues and professors were surprised that some of the graduates became fascists. And what Landon and I have been trying to do for a very long time is to show them, look, the father and the godfather of postmodern philosophy, Friedrich Nietzsche and Martin Heidegger, are not really your friends. And the ideas that they advanced have been incoherent for the left wing to take up. And Prometheus and Gaia is an extension of that, because we're not mostly talking about Nick Land, and we're not talking about far-right eco-fascists. We're talking about left accelerationists who have come out of Mark Fisher's call to take up accelerationism. So Benjamin Noyes wrote this book called Persistence of the Negative, where he's criticizing accelerationist thought. And Mark Fisher had this idea that, hey, maybe we should put a good spin on this, and Nick Land can be kind of our Nietzsche, like the weird uncle, and we're going to appropriate ideas from Nick Land and fuse them with Marx. And then when it comes to eco-pessimists, our main person that we're addressing is Bruno Latour. And Bruno Latour says, the modern project has exhausted itself, it's totalitarian, and maybe we can borrow some ideas from Eric Vogelin and Carl Schmitt. And when he talks about Schmitt, he says, well, you don't want to appropriate Schmitt too much, because that can turn you into a fascist. It's a matter of dosage. And Landon and I have consistently said that, like Lukács once wrote, to combine left-wing political and ethical commitments with this kind of right-wing epistemology is going to be a failed marriage. And maybe even worse, because it might lead people out of a left-wing commitment towards a right-wing commitment. And we have seen this in a continental context with a number of people. You've seen it with Nick Land, and now you even have someone like Alexander Dugin, who I would put in the eco-pessimist camp, because he thinks modernity is bad. We have to go back to a tradition. We should go back to the forest village and have a more pre-modern point of view. And they're able to exploit these moments in postmodern philosophy, which are Heideggerian and culturally pessimistic. So that's really what Landon and I have been consistently up to ever since the Jacobin articles and in Prometheus and Gaia.
And if I could just, piggyback on that and just add one additional comment, it's like, thinking back of our experiences in this continental department at Stony Brook University, part of what we're trying to do is fight this persistent academic amnesia that seems to be a plague on everyone in grad school and above. It's like, you read the original articles, right? You read the original existentialists. You read Sartre from the 40s in, speeches and pamphlets like Existentialism is a Humanism, Anti-Semite and Jew. And these people knew what they were doing. Okay, Sartre knew what he was doing. He's like, our professors from the previous generation were good leftists who believe in, universal reason, and that everyone globally has the same faculty of reason, and that's the basis of universal solidarity. I don't think that's right completely anymore. And in some sense, we need to emulate, he says in Anti-Semite and Jew, the synthetic worldview of the anti-Semite themselves while trying to combat anti-Semitism. In other words, adopt, as Harrison says, the epistemology, the ways of thinking of the right, in this sort of novel innovation to try and do a sort of outflanking political maneuver. It was clear in the 40s that left epistemology is naturally one which says that the world is intelligible, that there's an intelligible human nature, that there are objective goods to be achieved, right, through this sort of linking of rational agents beyond parochial boundaries. And that their innovation, and it was a self-conscious innovation, is that instead we should sort of play around with right-wing epistemology, the idea of mystery, the idea of spontaneity, the idea of the voluntaristic free will, okay, and the idea of metaphysical pluralism, that there is not one intelligible whole. They knew what they were doing. We don't know what we're doing now. right? You go to a continental graduate department in philosophy, and the idea that a sort of pluralism, free will, voluntarism, the idea of free self-creation is originally a right-wing idea is baffling to most students. It is just natural to them that this is the domain of the left, because the left has been taken over by either a kind of positivism in some departments, or more often a kind of free will romanticism. Part of what we're doing is just sort of cluing people into the fact that, like, that's not how it's always been, and it's not a natural position, and actually it's a very ill fit for left-wing politics.
So can I ask about this though, because I think that's a really important aspect, and we can go on. I think you we have a list of things that we discussed, but if I could follow up on this, I think it's really interesting. Is that you're speaking about I think a very particularly important move, which is and I think you identified it very well. Trying to understand from a level of deeper philosophy what's at stake in the fact that you have ostensibly and also explicitly left-wing academics who have given themselves either explicitly or implicitly to fascist politics and logics. And I think that you very nicely lay out that, in a certain sense, there's these kind of two philosophical traditions that are worth thinking about. One is a type of tradition that takes very seriously, like from Marx and Hegel, a very 19th century type of very particular type of 19th century rationalism and humanism, and the other is a type of Nietzschean and Heideggerian tradition, which doesn't. Now, my question is, where do you see some of the ways in which post-structuralism, and that, because I think that within the US, often there is a way in which that this has kind of been placed on the side of, as you said, the Heideggerian and Nietzschean tradition, right? But I certainly think in Europe, there's been a very strong ways in which this has been actually linked to a deepening post-Marxist tradition that plays exactly in one of the ways you're saying. And one way that you could read your book is that it's actually an incredibly sophisticated discussion of the ways in which, as you've kind of pointed out in one of your initial points, Landon, that there's these kind of very important symbolic myths that we have to encounter and that help to frame what is intelligible and therefore what is the limits of possibility that can be linked to these kind of objective notions of first principles. And I've been very interested in this because I have seen the ways that it seems like people like Foucault, for instance, the United States, have been in many ways incorporated. I mean, there was a book that I thought was, well, I don't know the person, but was so incredibly misguided, I cannot even begin, that was saying, Foucault just supported neoliberalism and these types of things without understanding at all of what Foucault, whether you agree or not, what the Foucauldian project was. So how would you see within these, things, I mean, this kind of tradition of being able to use, at least as epistemologies and techniques, which I think in a certain way you almost implicitly do in talking about mythologies, this type of kind of critical theory post-Marxist tradition, and how do we kind of, make sure that that doesn't fade into the exact type of, I would say, incorporation into types of right-wing traditions that I do think that you see in the US, and maybe much less so than in Europe.
So I'll let Harrison take this one, but just to make one prefatory remark. For our philosophy not to turn into just mere flux and soup, we need to make a critical distinction between sort of mythic images, mythic vocabulary, mythic objects on the one hand, which, as the scholastics might say, have a sort of nose of wax, can be endlessly repurposed, and philosophies on the other. Okay, so while it's true, I'm not going to, look at any particular philosopher's personal defect and throw them in the wastebin of history. Okay, that wouldn't be fair. At the same time, we need to recognize that philosophies and philosophical concepts are not polysemous and plastic in the way that mythic images are. They have and are meant to have, sort of truth content to them, right? And so, whether in the case of Foucault, okay, or post-structuralists writ large, there was a personal, self-conscious, subjective embrace of neoliberalism is not, to me, the question. The question is, do the concepts and sort of truth propositions that they put forward accommodate a neoliberal outlook or not, right? So like that's the question. So whereas we don't want to fetishize mythic concepts as having a power of their own, philosophical concepts I think are different, right? They have a logic of their own, and I think that's what we try and get across.
Yeah, I don't really want to weigh in too much on the Zamora last man takes LSD debate. I am, as you might know, Peter, a little more sympathetic to that than you are. But I will say, I wish neoliberalism was the only problem in Foucault. I think that when he's writing a review, like of André Glucksmann's The Master Thinkers, and he says Marxism itself is responsible for Stalinism and the Gulag, that is very similar to what you see on the contemporary right in terms of criticisms of communism. So I actually think that if Foucault is dependent upon these Nietzschean and Heideggerian premises, and he is, then those premises don't really lend themselves so easily to a left-wing project in terms of a conceptual coherence, that people will go home to Nietzsche and Heidegger, and they'll go home to the original political and ideological content of those thinkers. And that's why you do see people in continental philosophy today that have had a lot of education in Foucault and Bataille and Deleuze go to the right. There's nothing really stopping them in terms of those premises from the 19th century that Foucault took up. And I think there's going to be some kind of cachet of writings that I've been hearing about how Foucault is even more dependent on Nietzsche and Heidegger, and there's going to be more archival research. But I mean, we have enough to really criticize Foucault sufficiently, I think.
No, I mean, I would say, and I think this is a broader conversation. I think particularly the ways in which the Anglo world has taken up Foucault is that it kind of misses that he was also steeped in the kind of a Noel school of history, and this then also created, and I think you're absolutely both right. I mean, when I think there's certain political aspects that he has that is actually based on both Nietzsche and Heidegger that lend themselves to exactly the trajectory that you said. I think that there are other aspects, and I think this is where, there you could look at other theorists and philosophers like that are working from a more Gramscian tradition, etc. Right? But I think the point that you're making though that is really important is that, and I think this goes then to the next question, but the point that you're making that I think is really provocative and worth having discussion is, on the one hand, can post-structuralism lend itself, even the stronger insights, to the type of first principle philosophies that I think, Landon, you've kind of said now really well, is so important for an actual emancipatory revolutionary movement. And to be quite honest, I think that is an open question, right? And one that that we're not going to be able to solve in this seminar, but is really worth having. And I think it's a question that hasn't been asked. And I think if people would say, well, why is this important? I would just kind of reiterate, because we may even, be more or less sympathetic to certain ideas. So that I think the point you're making that, well, the proof is somewhat in the pudding, in the sense that without this kind of philosophical centering, without this commitment to a type of philosophical principles, you've seen how quickly and easily things can degenerate into types of fascism.
So I think
exactly things we would say. So yeah, I mean, I think those are points are well taken.
I would just interject one idea, right? So I think you're right. We're not going to solve it here. And there may be ways, it might be an open question, that certain figures, can lend themselves to something productive. The sort of allergy that I've developed at continental departments, however, is the framing of the question. The framing of the question is there nothing redeemable in Foucault? Is there nothing redeemable in Gramsci, Heidegger, post-structuralism? Frankly, and this is not certainly an indictment of you, but of the sort of general way that people talk, enough of the book chat. Really, it's obfuscating. It's throwing sand in the air. I am not here to pass judgment on long dead people or vague, groupings ill-defined of philosophers. tell me, what is the idea in Foucault that's redeemable? Why is it redeemable, and how does it work? I am perfectly sanguine about the possibility that there is such an idea. I don't know everything about Foucault. I didn't know him personally. If there's some good idea, well, let's name it. Let's be specific, and let's make an argument about why.
No, I think on that, I can't speak for everyone here. But I think that is something that we 100. You and I would say. I would say that I 100% agree with you. So like, just going on to the next question. But for me, Foucault, I'm not interested in redeeming Foucault as a person or a thinker. I'm interested in the question of political economy that he puts forth, which has been on, which is about the ways in which you can enable particular forces through the increase of capabilities historically, and also then they're disciplining within very particular types of collective agency and political processes. And I'm interested in, therefore, the relationship between discourse and materialization. And I think that's, but yeah, absolutely. And I think you put it perfectly. And I think it's an allergy, as you very nicely said, that I think I would like to give to all of my students, but also all of my colleagues, comrades, and fellow scholars. So I guess that goes then. I really want to say that I think that you kind of touched on this, but maybe you can articulate, because I think for me, it's a really strong crux of the book that I was really loved, which is that in chapter 4, you kind of proclaim that eco-pessimism and accelerationism have surprising affinities, right? And this is where I think we go beyond just trying to balance them or something, like that actually there's an underlying problem underpinning both, right? And you've talked about it a bit, but I'm just going to give the floor to you, because for me, when I read this was something like, as you said, it was like, okay, this is something that when I read it, I thought this is now going to be in my understandings of closer to truth as you can get, right? This is really important in saying something I think that hasn't been said before. So, or hasn't been said in the way that you've said it, or the important way. So what did you mean by this kind of idea of surprising affinities? And why did you think these affinities were quite significant?
So what really unites all the accelerationists and the eco-pessimists, and they know each other, and they polemicize against each other all the time. They're very close-knit groups. All the accelerationists know each other, all the eco-pessimists know each other. But what they have in common, besides coming from a continental philosophy background, they're all anti-humanists. And I think we can cash this out in a few ways. So what they both have in common is that either nature is less than nothing, or nature is this kind of transcendent, mysterious tremendum. So either we can be nominalists about nature or numinalists about nature, and that makes nature ineffable. So they share that kind of mysticism about nature. When it comes to thinking about life, or thinking about the will, or thinking about action, they're all anti-determinists. They all reject something called the principle of sufficient reason, which we get from Spinoza and Leibniz. And the accelerationists, particularly those working out of the Salesian tradition, they think the principle of sufficient reason is a kind of myth of the given. They think that the sciences really don't need the principle of sufficient reason. It's kind of like going back to the Einstein-Niels Bohr debate. So Einstein takes up the Spinoza's position. He says, God doesn't play dice. Niels Bohr says, don't tell God what to do. So reality becomes very antinomian in that way. It becomes kind of anarchic. And the Excels agree with that, especially those coming out of this anti-correlationist idea that the intellect and reality have to be correlated. Since Parmenides, we have this identity between thinking and being. They reject that identity as being metaphysical. And then with the eco-pessimists, everything is alive in some sense. Everything is in understanding a kind of panpsychism. And Latour, in his Gifford lectures on Facing Gaia, he says, when we talk about cause and effect, this is a human imposition onto things. And that's not even how we experience things. We experience the effects first. So we experience things in terms of a narrative drama. And what the rationalist wants to do with their determinism is make everything dead. So we're going to make reality alive again. And the last thing is they both have in common this big emphasis on myth. So for the accelerationists, it's this idea of hyperstition, that we can turn our fictions into reality. The past really isn't real. The future is more real than the past, and we can start to re-engineer our reality in this mystical way. And the Gaians, or the eco-pessimists, because nature is mysterious, the way we relate to nature has to be mystical and mythical. So it's not that you understand the world objectively, according to Donna Haraway. You have to do some worlding. You have to create as you're trying to be humble to this mysterious tremendum that is nature. And to know is to do violence to it.
So can I follow that up? Because that's something that I think touches on what we just last spoke about that I would like to explore a bit more. Is that, in a sense, I think there's two types of affinities, and you really nicely put it. The one I would say is a type of thing that is linked to a 19th century that hasn't ended, right? So the contradictions that we're facing. But then the other is something that I do think is really interesting in terms of what we've been talking about in terms of first principles things, which is that it's also the mythic nature of these, right? And that a kind of actual revolutionaries, politics would have to engage with or have a different epistemology that is not mythical. And I'm wondering if you agree with that, because I think that was kind of underlined in the book, but could have even been made broader. And if so, maybe talk a bit more about like what a type of non-mythical epistemology and political engagement would look like, because I think that does touch on what we spoke about and is quite important. Right.
So very quickly, Landon and I are really inspired by the first 1800 program of German idealism, where Hölderlin and Schelling and Hegel, they get together in Tübingen, and they said, what we need is a mythology of reason. But that means the myth is illustrative. It's not constitutive. You need to work out your philosophy first. So in that regard, Landon and I are closer to Plato and Freud to some extent and Bertolt Brecht. You have the theory, and then the theory helps to animate the art. And I guess with Lukács, a great grasp of the totality can inspire great works of art, great works of literature. And that is the kind of ideological and effective inspiration that we need. But without, to paraphrase Lenin, you need theory for the movement. You also need, I think, a great theory to animate and revitalize these myths. And there's a distinction that Landon and I make between the mythic, which is telling stories to animate certain philosophical points, and the mystical, which, as Landon said, collapses the myth with the rational idea. And I think in terms of our analysis, it's important to make a distinction between the idea and the image. And sometimes it's hard to see where the idea ends and the image begins, but with these accelerationist and eco-pessimist traditions, they're blurred.
But this is why I think we're against a sort of politics that has nothing at all to do with myth, as though you can expel political images from your vocabulary and from your tactics. I think that's a really dangerous thing to do. And I don't think it's a very radical thing to do. So in other writings, right, we point out the distinction between a sort of neutral state, the neutral liberal Rawlsian state, as opposed to the Erastian one, right? So the Erastian state, this will get me in trouble, but back to the French Revolution, okay, and the idea of the cult of reason, okay, there is this idea that instead of letting mythic images run off with unreason and the imagination, okay, and the passions, and do whatever they do, because after all, the state is neutral and should not deal with such crass things. No. You capture and press into service those very images for a very clear and distinct political program based on first principles and sound reason. So like the only way to make sure that your myths don't run away from you is to use them, is to keep an eye on them.
We're Jacobins. We believe in pomp and circumstance.
Yeah.
No, I thought I'm glad because I think that's a really important and brilliant part in better understanding that. helps to actually really set a stage of like why myths are important, but actually what's at stake in terms of doing the kind of broader intellectual revolution project that you're doing. So I think I'm going to do this thing, which I don't always do, but it also gives a taste. I mean, I really enjoyed how this book was written. And if it's all right, I just want to read this kind of last bit and have you maybe talk a bit about it. And then there's a couple more critical questions kind of after this that I think would be worth exploring. And then we can open it up. Is that all right?
Sure.
So I really like this. It says, you conclude with this inspiring vision, and you said, we can affirm Marx's vision of Prometheus as the enemy of illegitimate authority everywhere, a rebel against all heavenly and earthly gods who recognizes only humanity as the highest divinity. Prometheus evokes the liberation of technology and production from the rock that is class society. It is the abolition of an artificial scarcity that is imposed, not by natural circumstances, but by profit motive. The masses must become like Prometheus unbound, just as Prometheism must become social and democratic. It is a matter of taking the fire of technology into our own collective control. At the same time, this collective control is nothing and remains utterly directionless if we imagine humanity as merely a free-floating subjectivity. If we persist in the delusion that there is no human nature, no determinate human ends or conditions for flourishing, then all the agency and control in the world will have no meaningful purpose. It is the fact of our common identity in nature, and this is italicized, indeed that we are all, quote, part of nature that makes us one humanity sharing a common essence. In this, Gaia should not be understood as a transcendent, mysterious being, but rather as an intelligible substance to which we all belong. This objective identity not only reveals the intelligible conditions of our flourishing, but as we have also seen, actively compels us to pursue this common good. I find that very inspiring, incredible. But I wonder if you could describe this vision a bit more, because it's a lot to pack into a paragraph. And I know I was coming at that, so you've got to have a whole book too. But and how you actually think, and I don't mean to actually, I should have changed the tone up because I do see very, but you're here, so I would like you to speak to it. But how this would inform contemporary radical and revolutionary environmental movements.
Well, I how do I put this? I think that as you say that it's inspiring. People don't usually talk about philosophical first principles as inspiring. People usually talk about them as boring. And I'm glad that they're inspiring to you because they're inspiring to me. Our first principle is monism, it's metaphysical monism. It's the idea that there is one intelligible substance, infinite and eternal, that everything necessarily belongs to, and therefore that things can be understood intelligibly relative to one another, and that people and peoples can be understood intelligibly relative to one another. And I think the big picture for us, and if anything is inspiring about substance monism, it's this, and you get it in parts 4 and 5 of Spinoza's magnum opus, the Ethics, very clearly. That monism does double duty. Okay, so monism, because it renders the world unified and intelligible, allows us to make sense of the world, allows us to build tactics and strategy, allows us to make structural assessments of our place, including the place of the most important class today, the working class, to understand its fundamental unity and the fundamental way forward. As well as the sort of limited and temporary contradictions that it suffers as well. So that's the first of the two things that monism does. It renders the world intelligible and allows us to meaningfully make plans. But that's not it. The other thing that monism compels us to do is to seek that good. Okay, so it not only allows us in a sort of bloodless, descriptive way to make plans and to see the way forward, but it compels us, and this goes back to the tradition of the Stoics and the idea of oikeiosis. It compels us to understand our very identity as inseparable from the identity of other people, and especially other rational creatures, right? That because we are part of this same self-causing substance. Spinoza calls causa sui. All things in nature have a positive existence, have a sort of striving or conatus. In other words, have a desire for their own increased flourishing and welfare. And because the context is monism, the conclusion, the inexorable conclusion, is that my innate desire for flourishing and welfare is not separable in principle, at the most basic metaphysical level, is not separable from the flourishing and welfare of other people. People make fun of us for that. What fanciful moralizing, how bourgeois, right? To think that we should just all, come together as humanity. What about class analysis, right? Someone who will remain nameless panned us by saying, apes together strong, right? Oh, ridiculous. No, unless you have this basic metaphysical affirmation of common human flourishing and unity, all of your best laid plans, all of your, and this is necessary, all of your intelligible structural insights into class prospects and differences, these are unmotivated. They remain, well, frankly, sterile. And so if anything is inspiring in monism, I think it's that. It's those two functions of telling us that the world is intelligible and we can move forward without mystification, and also that we must do so.
There's been this raging debate among growth and degrowth Marxists about dualism versus monism. And this was taken up again in Saito's book, Marx and the Anthropocene. And he was criticizing Jason Moore's position as monist. The problem with Moore's monism is that it's inspired by Donna Haraway, Latour, network theory. And that kind of monism, for our perspective, Landon and my perspective, is very pluralist. In fact, it goes back to Deleuze and Guattari when they say monism equals pluralism, or when Deleuze says against Spinoza's original conception that the modes don't revolve around substance, substance revolves around the modes. And what Moore and the Latourians do is they say nature and culture should just be seen as one, which is its own kind of anthropomorphism, I think, because then everything becomes alive and everything has like this crypto-humanist agentic quality to it. And that has a lot in common with, let's say, object-oriented ontology with Graham Harman. And then you have the opposite criticism that comes from Saito, that no, and this also has to do with Andreas Malm's criticisms, that you don't want monism because that absolves the human being of their agency and guilt in this climate catastrophe that we're in. So we have to keep a dualistic, non-identity understanding between nature and society, and that's more inspired by Adorno. For our position, the reason that we care is going to this concept of oikiosis, that we're able to see the shared identity within the difference between other human beings, other sentient creatures, and against someone like Jeremy Bentham, who says, well, don't ask if the animal thinks, ask if the animal feels. Feeling is a kind of thinking. And that's really why we should have solidarity, not just with other human beings, but with other species, and not necessarily a piece of dust, because the piece of dust doesn't have a sense of self on any level. It doesn't have a sense of self-care or interest. And you need to have some kind of consciousness in order for us to have that kind of oikiotic solidarity. But without that conception of nature, without that conception of human nature, without that conception of this kind of shared need, the political commitment will be, I think, hollow. There won't be anything to really rationally justify it. It will turn into a kind of moralism.
Or a kind of voluntarism, that you just choose your political commitments sort of existentially. And then indeed, they're so unmoored that they could become quite reactionary. In fact, tend to become quite reactionary, because if the choice is between a sort of universal solidarity with everyone based on reason, or the passionate ties of those that are like you, well, we know which will win out. I mean, read the newspaper.
So I apologize for the technical difficulties on my end, but I was able to only miss a couple minutes, and I think that's a really important kind of description, and also sets the stage for why this is so important. I think the one aspect that people may, and I like to ask you in this, and it's the kind of question, is that people may have a concern about the fact that when you usually think about ideas of universal reason or human nature, there is a type of kind of Eurocentrism that may be at play. Now, I from reading all your work and knowing both of you, I know that wouldn't be something that I would assume you would embrace. But I thought maybe you could kind of talking about is how could this kind of universal reason, this kind of return of humanism that has actually been brought into and used for colonial and imperial projects, how could we think about these things and consider these things in a way that doesn't just reproduce this, but actually follows in a more radical revolutionary tradition that you've laid out so far in this seminar and in your book and in your other writings?
Well, part of the issue is that when so-called Enlightenment ideas or so-called ideas of universal reason have been used to enslave people, have been used as a defense of colonialism and imperialism, it's because it's because these ideas have not been upheld consistently. And so one cannot uphold a sort of monistic idea of reason, the idea that all people share in a common intellect and therefore can understand one another on an intellectual basis, and then go around and enslave people, and then go around and say that some people are subhuman. I mean, that's the first thing that has to be said on principle, that these ideas are simply at loggerheads with one another. That's at least my starting point. I don't know if Harrison wants to say anything more specific, but I think that's the headline.
I think our position is anti-colonialist, but it's also modern. We support a nation's right to self-determination, and obviously against imperialism. But the only real way I think that would be sustainable is to have a internationalist, cosmopolitan, socialist order, or else you have the trap of nationalism and the trap of creating an ethno-state that's in competition with other states. So what we want is a kind of anti-colonialist, internationalist humanism, the kind of humanism and internationalism and socialism that inspired all kinds of anti-colonial movements throughout the 20th century. And these anti-colonial movements were not anti-modern. They did not want to be exoticized by the West. They wanted technological advancements, modernization to empower their people. And I think that's really what we're fighting for. In terms of, let's say, quoting Fred Hampton, he was giving an interview as a deputy chairman of the Black Panther Party in Detroit, and he said, unless you link the struggles of oppressed people, unless you link Black liberation to socialism, to communism, you're going to have the problem of Black capitalism and Black imperialism. And we want to be able to have an international movement that unites these various anti-colonial projects, these various projects against racism and sexism, and the thing that's going to tie them all together is this kind of international humanism that Landon and I think subscribe to.
I also subscribe to that, and I think it's very important, and I wanted to give that space to discuss because I think it is something that is often missed. I guess I just have like one kind of final question, and then we'll open it up to the broader seminar. Stephen, Elaine, and Ariel, you might have some ideas that you'd like us to bring in. Is that you mention the idea, both philosophically and I guess in praxis, this notion of the common desire for flourishing, right? And here, I would like to get a better understanding of how we contextualize and think about flourishing, right? And how that then could relate to a range of kind of different ideas of combining first principles with, the emergence of radical forms of shared intellect. And I guess this touches on the last question, thinking about how, a cosmopolitan experience or revolutionary movement with, for instance, indigenous communities, not only is about, as you've said, Harrison, a kind of liberatory sharing of technology and ideas for progress, but also integrates them potentially with new means and visionings of what flourishing actually constitutes. So I wanted to see why you chose the word flourishing, which is, I think an important word, and how this kind of idea or concept of flourishing, which seems to play such an important, I think, inspiring part of your work, how, if you could maybe explore that a bit more.
Well, all right. So there was a lot there. The notion of flourishing, the notion of the sort of interaction between cosmopolitan politics and the notion of indigenous liberation. I would say this: any time that you wade into this conversation, of cosmopolitanism, you're going to have to decide where the emphasis is that you place on that word. So famously or infamously, Etienne Balibar says that he believes in the cosmopolitical, but with an italicization, with an emphasis on the suffix, the political. So yes, in some sense, we might asymptotally tend towards some kind of greater solidarity and unity, maybe even a global one. But talking about this now is rather premature, and the emphasis is on the political, on the sort of agonistic bottom-up struggle. And a lot of people find a lot of comfort in that because it sort of splits the difference, right? I think what we want to do, and Harrison, you can correct me if I'm off base here, but is put the emphasis on the prefix, the cosmos, that there is something objective and intelligible that always already unites all people and all liberatory struggles that are genuinely liberatory. Right? So unless there is this always already intelligible human nature and notion of rational flourishing, basically being able to more adequately understand the world that you live in, and all of the material prerequisites that go into being able to understand and live in the world writ large, then your project is lost. Unless the cosmos, unless the unity, unless the universal is there first, those local political struggles might not actually integrate well with one another, might actually become hostile to one another, and as Harrison said, might actually degrade and become quite reactionary. So, of course, one supports indigenous struggles, native struggles against brutal colonial powers. Why? Because those brutal colonial powers treat other human beings as subhuman. They do not recognize them in their full rational humanity. But there is always this worry, the sort of native liberation struggle can become nativism. And what is the sort of theory, the guiding theory that stops that backsliding, that stops that reactionary tendency from occurring? Well, again, it has to be this affirmation that we are, first of all rational human beings.
As the great Irish Marxist James Connolly once said, our demands are moderate. We only want the earth. Unless we have the earth, unless we have an international mass society, we will not achieve a sustainable kind of emancipation, either for indigenous people or for any kind of global proletariat. And I think it's true, Goldman Sachs doesn't care about your anarcho-communist vegetable garden that you're growing, but Landon and I do not want to see the attempts at local commons ownership to be erased, to be evicted, to go through any kind of austerity pressure. But there are those pressures. And what becomes a kind of utopian socialist project that's local starts to resemble a petty bourgeois business. And I think the only way to have that kind of socialist project is to accept Marx and Engels' criticisms of this kind of 19th century utopian romantic movement, and to have a more global kind of political project. And as Trotsky said, you can't build socialism in one country. So you're not going to build socialism in one co-op or one city. And the problem is a lot of contemporary theory ignores the state, ignores seizing state power, not in order to maintain the bourgeois state, but to overcome it. And with Foucault and Tony Negri, there seems to be more of a focus on the micro-political, and we want to return to a much more classic Marxist understanding of building a mass working class party. And as Lenin said, you need to have a tribune of the people. The tribune of the people is not a narrow-minded economist who just cares about trade union struggles. A tribune of the people cares about all struggles, anti-colonial struggles, anti-sexist struggles, democratic struggles, but as unified in a global movement.
And there's a sort of parallelism here between the political and the economic. So just as from sort of first principles, we want a unified, humanist, internationalist political struggle, so it goes on the side of economics, that the idea that you can merely have these sites of resistance, these sort of local co-ops, which again should be supported in the short term and maybe even the medium term. But the idea that this is the sort of horizon of your economics and politics is deeply romantic from a materialist point of view. What effectively this does is to say that we're going to sort of just sort of reset the story, reset the game, right? That instead of large-scale international global capitalism, we're going to have, you know, multiple small private holdings. Well, multiple small private holdings has been done before, right? Humanity has done that, and it still produces scarcity, and it will still produce local inequality and exploitation in the long run. You know, so part of the lesson of the book, I think, is that really the only way forward is forward, right? We can't have these sort of romantic dalliances back into the past as though we can tame global capitalism merely by local resistance and struggle. You'll have the same issues cropping up again and again and again, as we have had in history.
Mm-hmm. No, I think that's really important, and just, I know Stephen has his hands up, so I'd just like to conclude by, you know, thanking both of you. I think it's an incredibly important thing to end on. Certainly, if it's a key aspect to cover, and what we're also doing in our management marketing group is looking very specifically at the movement from local alternatives to actually global transitions and what's at stake with that. And I think, as you very nicely said, Landon, you know, how do we create horizons of possibility that are not just about local experimentation that can be incorporated and co-opted, but fundamentally are about revolutionary changes to our mode of production for the, you know, ability to live and exist in a different type of world. So thank you both very much. Now I'm going to open it up. Stephen, I saw your hand. Did you want to maybe start?
I'm going to ask a question. It might be sort of a new question, but sort of going on with you were talking a little bit about indigenous struggles. And I'm thinking here about practices. I'm thinking mainly starting from Bolivia, where there's sort of a framework. I think I'm getting indigenous cultures where nature is given a legal personhood and is integrated into a system of governance, but directly. And I was curious what you thought of that, given that, at least to my mind, this doesn't fall neatly either into a Promethean or a Gaian perspective, and that it's almost like this kind of midpoint of like trying to, let's say, not fall into a localist, small is beautiful kind of thing, but trying to scale it up into a sort of more, into a framework that could be a legal juridical framework rather than a localist one, if that makes sense. So I just wonder what you thought of things like that.
Yeah, well, I have studied these cases and especially the legal cases quite a bit. And frankly, on the top of it, I have to say some of them are quite effective. Okay, in South America, the idea of granting a legal personhood to regions, to land and water features, have at times been effective, not only in changing national constitutions, but actually in winning civil and criminal court cases to get reparations from rapacious oil companies, to stop indigenous land from being taken over for the purpose of the extractive industries. So the first thing that has to be said is, you know, anything that works, right? So in the short term, if you're trying to stop people from being pushed off their land, you're trying to stop this sort of suicidal death march of the extractive, especially fossil fuel industry, then good. Then that's the first thing that we say, and that's the thing that one must say in public loudly and repeatedly. The next question, upon a moment of reflection, is okay, so does that mean that everyone has to believe that this is in fact true, that land features, a river, a mountain, actually has not only legal personality as a legal fiction, like ships and corporations have, but that actually has itself an actual sort of metaphysical personhood? And well, this is a discussion we have amongst comrades. This is not a discussion that we necessarily have in the media when across the table is the rapacious oil industry, okay? But amongst comrades, the question is, okay, that's an interesting idea. What actually is the argument for this? And so, I mean, that's what I want to know, right? Like, I don't think that it's appropriate to simply insist people buy into a metaphysical, religious, or spiritual picture merely because it's effective. If it's effective, then you use it, damn it, right? Good. And they're on the right side. But in terms of a moment of academic, or personal reflection, it's like, well, not everything that's effective is necessarily also true. And is this a case of we leave people alone with their beliefs out of respect? Fine, I can get on board with that. Is it also the case that everyone also has to adopt that belief? I'm not sure. There is this sort of all too generic idea of the struggles of the global South, universal indigenous or aboriginal struggle. I think this can tend towards condescension sometimes, and a sort of bad stereotyping, right? Indigenous and aboriginal peoples in New Zealand might have precious little in common with those in the Andes or the Amazon. And so, well, look, let's just get more specific and actually talk about what people believe and what people expect other people to believe in order to join in on this, I think, quite admirable struggle.
Thanks for that. Just as a quick follow-up thought, it's interesting that when you say about question about with comrades about whether you actually buy into the metaphysics of whether a river actually has personhood, and I can understand that, but it's funny that we're so naturalized into the idea that there is corporate personhood or abstract national personhood, which is just as you might say, as mythological as well. But it almost seems to not be because we've gotten so used to it.
Well, it's certainly worse, practically. Corporate personhood is worse. I mean, unless it allows you to be sued, in which case, I don't know, maybe it's better. I'm not a lawyer. I've seen both in the news. But to be fair to the terrible people who tout corporate personhood, and they are terrible, they might not be self-consciously making a metaphysical statement.
So could I ask a question? And I really liked the way you said this, Harrison. And you kind of use this very I guess popular phrase of the acceleration to start go big or go home. And then you ended with, I think, a really, really strong, beautiful thing about saying, look, we can't just rely on kind of local solutions. We have to think in terms of the construction of a global kind of working class mass movement. And I'm wondering if we can talk about in a certain way, then are we, is this project in a certain sense a rejection of bigness, or is it a kind of reimagination of what bigness could be? Because, I think when you're talking about something like climate change, I think we are talking about something that is very much requiring big solutions and also is about our survival. So I was just kind of wondering about that.
So to clarify, when Nick Land says go big or go home, he's trying to compare Deleuze's Anti-Oedipus with Thousand Plateaus. He thinks that the distinction that Deleuze and Guattari make between speed and intensity is a cop-out, and that he much prefers the kind of much more straightforward accelerationist focus and anti-Oedipus. That's why he says go big or go home. So for Land, go big or go home means get rid of your humanism, get rid of your Marxism, get rid of your socialism, and just have a full throttle corporate kind of capitalism that's going to resemble the corporation in the Alien movies or Skynet in Terminator. So that's the kind of bigness he wants, and it's not big for everyone. If people are interested, they can look up this debate that Land and Peter Wolfendale had 2 years ago. I think it was sponsored by the Center for New Research. And Wolfendale, who's a kind of left accelerationist, is trying to protest with Land and say, well, we need to have universal normative structures. It's kind of very neo-Kantian thing. And Land basically said to him, I don't need to convince everyone. I just need to convince a few people. And they can exit democracy with me. So it's big, but in a kind of narrow, elitist, aristocratic way. And when Landon and I are talking about a mass movement, we're talking about the kind of focus on mass society and an international working class politics that Marx and Engels originally had in mind. We kind of want to return to that more classical model. And these ideas of bigness that you get in Futurism are so otherworldly and romantic and occult-like that it just becomes ineffable, and they really can't properly map out what they mean by something that's progressive or something that would be that kind of global politics that we need.
So I know that it's 3:30. You've been here for an hour and a half. I mean, you've covered so many different things. I know that, Elaine, you mentioned that, this gave you a lot to think about. I'm wondering, I just want to open up if people have other questions that they might like to ask. So what I would like to do then is the following, which is almost like a little bit of a late night show type of thing. Not to plug, but I know that, you worked on this book. It's a fantastic book. But now you're working on some other things, and you kind of did Reason is Red, but now you're working very particularly on questions of the far right. You talked about that, but maybe in a certain sense, we could do almost like a critical plug of like, looking at this and thinking of like what's next, and in a way, what's going, what should we be, reading from you next, and why have you kind of moved in that direction? Because I think this book really is an exciting contribution, and I think the work that you've been doing, like I think quite honestly around these kind of like how do we link praxis to first principles is really important. So to almost do a kind of late night thing, like what do you have to plug?
Well, so yeah, right now we are working on this book titled Pending, on critiquing major figures on the right, especially in the media and the popular press, Peterson, Musk, and Tate. My next book project after that is going to be based on my dissertation. It's going to be on Spinoza and the sort of opposition between pluralism, both metaphysical and political, and monism, and especially the question of whether toleration is possible given a monistic worldview. Spoiler alert, the answer is yes. But that's where I'm heading next. In the immediate term, I just published an op-ed on the ongoing criminal humanitarian crisis in Gaza. If you want to read that, I have a link to the unblocked article on my own professional website, landonfrim.wordpress.com. It's called Gaza Slaughter Not in My Name. And although it doesn't mention Spinoza or metaphysics or philosophy directly, it's a popular op-ed for a daily newspaper. The careful reader will see how these interventions are absolutely related to those first principles. That I think that in fact you can't have one without the other. We want to get beyond sort of blind tribal allegiances and actually make a humane and humanistic intervention in the world, then we have to do so from some intelligible starting point.
Well, that I think both those things sound really exciting. Harrison.
There is a third category among the Prometheans and Gaeans that we talk about in the book, and that's the Olympians. So if the Prometheans want to transgress all limits in favor of the future, and the Gaeans want to kind of reify limit so that we can humble ourselves before nature, there is this third position of order and conservatism and legitimacy. You can almost call it like a Zeusian position or a Jupiter position. And this is, for us in Prometheus and Gaia, represented by Jordan Peterson, because Jordan Peterson, in his ramblings about myth, usually targets the Gaians, which is part of his anti-feminism, but he also targets the Prometheans as Luciferian, that they want to know everything and then control everything. So for Peterson, you need a proper monotheism, a kind of Marduk, Zeusian, Yahweh monotheism that's going to control these extremes, which are themselves ideological and mythical expressions of what Landon and I think can be redeemed. Gaia as representing nature, Prometheus as representing progress. These aren't things that we want to throw out, but for Peterson, the Olympian gods or kind of monarchical monotheism has to control them. So what we want to do is expand on the Olympian section in our new book. And the first chapter is totally devoted to Peterson as a kind of guru dad. And then we're going to talk about Elon Musk and Andrew Tate. As far as personal projects for me, like Landon, I also want to make my dissertation into a book manuscript that's going to be about Hegel and Hegel's relationship to Spinoza. And I hope that I will be able to focus on Hegel for the rest of my lifetime. As Ernst Bloch said, there's always time for Hegel.
Oh, wow. Both those sound really exciting. So Spinoza and Hegel, two of, I think you wouldn't be alone in saying they're two of our favorites. And I like that about the Olympians. So no, I feel very honored that this was the first book published in our book series. And I'm really excited about the book. And I'm really excited about being able to have both of you here, because I think, you represent two, if I'm allowed to say it, even though arguing for the mass society, kind of on the vanguard of thinking about what is a revolutionary philosophy and therefore praxis. So I really appreciated you both coming, and I'm sure this is the beginning of ongoing conversations. So I want to thank both of you. I really appreciate it. And yeah, we will be putting this out so others can watch this recording, and we'll be promoting it. And again, thank you so much for taking the time to come speak with us at our seminar for cover today, Landon and Harrison.
We
very
really
welcome.
do appreciate the opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you so much for inviting us. It was a great conversation.
Oh, thank you both.